Zur Veränderung der globalen Medienlandschaft hat er schon vor ein paar Jahren gesagt, wir konkurrieren längst nicht mehr nur mit der Financial Times oder dem Economist, sondern auch mit Facebook, Google, BuzzFeed und Vice und so weiter. Wir sind also gespannt, wie er den Wandel der Medienlandschaft heute sieht. Please welcome the President International of the New York Times Company, Stephen Dunbar-Johnson.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Sandra. I think I got most of that. I apologize for not being able to speak in German, however. I think examining the shifting media landscape is quite a fitting topic, given the many changes the news industry is experiencing today. Regardless of whether or not you work in the media, anybody who believes in democratic values should see the value in such a discussion, I hope. After all, for democracy to survive and thrive, a prerequisite is a free press. Yet it is no secret that the past few decades have been brutal for news organizations. We needn't even think too far in the past to see examples of direct attacks on journalism. Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi being the most recent and brutal example. Less gruesome, but also troubling, is the story of a journalist from the Financial Times, Victor Mallet, who was denied a visa renewal by the Hong Kong government for the offence of having moderated a panel discussion featuring a critic of the government. Research from the Committee to Protect Journalists has shown that in just under 2 years, that's 2 years, 90 journalists have died whilst reporting. Journalism has become an increasingly dangerous profession in recent times. Yet the work they do is more necessary than ever. Since 2000, the number of reporters working in the United States has declined by more than a half. The numbers across Europe are also bleak. Newsroom budgets are being slashed, foreign bureaus are closing, journalistic standards are declining. I'm pleased and proud to say that that is not happening at the New York Times, the organization I work for. In fact, we're experiencing quite the opposite, for a myriad of reasons, but perhaps mainly because of our insistence in investing in the independent journalism that defines the institution and is at our core. But I'm going to come back to that a little later. I do believe that it's important to step back for a moment, though, and provide context to the current state of the industry and what makes it such a dynamic space during this current time. The media landscape is being shaped by two pressures that to a great extent feed off each other. The first is the gathering pace of autocratic rule around the world, where the suppression of a free and open media is on the rise. We're seeing this in Russia, we're seeing it in Turkey, we're seeing it in Mexico, we're seeing it in Hungary, just in our backyard here in the EU, and in numerous other countries around the world. The New York Times is reporting extensively on this, has reported extensively on this over the last year, in fact over the last several years. The second pressure is the rise of the social media platform BMOS, who are dominating the advertising marketplace, depriving both traditional and new digital media outlets of the advertising revenue stream that has traditionally been the lifeblood that has supported journalism for many of them. But let's dig into the second of these first. Now, it's true that the digital revolution has empowered the individual. It has hastened the exchange of ideas in our lifetimes. We have been very fortunate to witness this age of acceleration. Life expectancy is up. Literacy is up. Infant and maternal mortality are both down. Death in conflict is down. One can also make a powerful case that the fixes for mankind's most profound challenges can be solved or partially solved through technology. I think it's also both important and useful to put the disruption of the digital age on the media industry and society as a whole into a historical context. As the historian from Yale, Tim Snyder, has pointed out, innovations in media have always been accompanied by great ruptures in society. The advent of the printing press was followed by 150 years of religious wars here in Europe. Radio was the principal medium used by the powerful regimes of the early 20th century to rein control over the populace. So with that in context and that in mind, the internet age has caused sweeping disruption and often very positive disruptions. It has not, so far, been the cause of significantly bloody disruption, so far. It is also true that it has helped news organizations broaden their reach. We at the New York Times are read by more people now around the world than ever in our history, thanks to the digital revolution. Today, we have more than 2.9 million digital-only subscribers. However, contrary to the early promise of the internet age, the revolution has not just redistributed power, it has concentrated it in the hands of very few. It has, and still is, depriving news organizations of the advertising streams that have been the key revenue drivers that have supported the journalism, as I mentioned earlier. Too few news outlets have managed to successfully adapt their business models to this reality. Increasingly, from the perspective of someone who spent much of his career in the media business bridging between the analog and the digital age, it seems that whilst we may have been emancipated from the industrial toil, we have swapped it for a digital dystopia. Rereading George Orwell's 1984 should be a requirement for anybody today who still doubts that a distortion of truth and a rewriting of history can't happen. Orwell's book, read in today's social media reality, is remarkably and scarily prescient. Truth and democracy are struggling to cope with the challenges posed by what's happening on the computer screen and on the tablets that we are all now so wedded to. The giants of Silicon Valley, the platforms, have an increasing list of charges that are being leveled at them: the facilitation of hate speech and terrorism, the algorithmic fostering of division and the fueling of polarization. And of course, there is the issue of so-called fake news, assorted populists and extremists, assorted trolls and bots, not to mention the 45th President of the United States, are doing their best to convince the world that dispassionate, accurate journalism is fake news, and conspiracy theories, gross exaggeration, and outright lies are the real thing. And when one describes the free press as the enemy of the people, you're pouring fire on this situation and making the job of journalists in many parts of the world that much more dangerous. These attacks on the press aim to level reality with their own reality. The alternative facts, as White House Counselor Kellyanne Conway described them. And by this process of leveling, they rob serious journalism of its civic impact and value. They don't need to be believed to succeed. They merely need to sow enough doubt in enough minds that a large slice of the population no longer knows who to trust. But the most serious threat facing journalism is not this, but rather the disruption of the traditional business model for journalism, particularly local news, and the failure of all but a handful of big national and international titles across the Western world which include the New York Times, to find credible digital alternatives. This issue is much more intractable. Intractable because democracies cannot remain healthy if citizens are left unaware of what is happening in their communities. And as I said earlier, regional, national, and international journalism, which historically played such an important role in meeting these civic needs, is ailing, and in some areas, it's dying. There are exceptions, however, and the New York Times, as I've already said, is one of them. The Times realized that in this time of struggling advertising revenue streams, we needed to have an effective digital distribution model that allowed us to develop a deep relationship of our most engaged and loyal readers, and that our readers would pay for that experience as long as it led to access to the highest quality of journalism. Essentially, we realized, and our thinking has become even more crystallized around this, that an effective digital subscription model offered a far more promising path to the future than digital advertising alone. And as I mentioned earlier, the New York Times has more digital news subscribers than any other news organization in the world. And with close to 4 million total subscribers, twice as many total subscribers as at the peak of print 25 years ago. The Times' revenue and profits have been growing. Despite what some may say, the Times is far from failing. It is thriving. We responded to the disruption of the digital revolution not by disinvesting in high-quality news and opinion, but by doubling down on it. The Times newsroom and editorial department has grown to 1,450 women and men today, bigger than it was 20 years ago. We have added 125 news reporters just this last year, and we have added 2 new bureaus, bringing our roster of 32 around the world. We maintain bureaus in Baghdad, in Kabul, in places where many organizations have long gone from. In the last 12 months, we have reported from over 160 countries. This is not the result of the Times' success in this digital era, but rather the reason for it. It's the reason for our success. We have found that despite this disaggregated world we now live in, and perhaps because of it, that there are still a growing number of people around the world who are willing to pay for news that increasingly they can't find anywhere else. And the political pressure on journalism around the world has further reinforced our conviction that what we do matters, and that good journalism is both essential for a healthy society, but it is also good for business. They are mutually reinforcing. Good journalism is good business. However, our particular brand of rigorous, independent, without fear or favor journalism is an increasingly rare commodity. While the Times may be rising to the challenge with some success, the overall landscape is deeply concerning. We believe that for democracy to remain healthy, unbounded competition between different journalistic perspectives and the clash of different judgments and opinions is both necessary and vital. It is important that people read broadly and that they are exposed to a range of news and opinion, Open societies require multiple independent points of editorial control, which can compete and hold each other to account, and between which the public can choose. But we are now faced with the fact that major platforms may decide or feel pressured to replace this plurality with single points of algorithmic editorial control. This, to us, is deeply concerning. As I mentioned earlier, along with the immense challenges that the rise of the social media platforms present us, we are also faced with the clamping down on independent media by autocratic regimes around the world. This has resulted in a steady street decline in the number of people around the globe who are exposed to a truly free and independent media. The most recent Freedom of the Press report, published by Freedom House, the Washington-based independent watchdog, shows press freedom globally has declined to its lowest levels since the turn of the millennium. In 2017, a free press stood at just 13. The world's population, the percentage of the world's population that enjoy a free press, stood at just 13%. That's 13%, meaning fewer than 1 in 7 people live in countries where coverage of political news is robust, the safety of journalists is guaranteed, state intrusion in media affairs is minimal, and the press is not subject to onerous legal or economic pressures. This is largely due to new threats to journalists and media outlets in major democracies, and to further crackdowns on independent media in authoritarian countries. China has witnessed a continuing trend of ideological tightening and increased regulation. The mainstream media in Russia continues to conform to official narratives on issues like Russia's occupation of Crimea and military intervention in Syria. And the dissemination of critical views on those topics can result in website blocking or prison sentences. Turkey, who only a couple of years ago had a vibrant press, is now a place where the practice of independent journalism is a perilous occupation, with so many journalists now imprisoned. And the far-reaching attacks on the news media by Donald Trump, first as a candidate and now as President of the United States, has added rocket fuel to this state of affairs. It's a paradox, ladies and gentlemen, and speaks directly to today's challenges that in large parts of the world, the problem of the information age is not too little state intervention, it is too much. On the one hand, authoritarian regimes are keeping technology and media companies on a tight leash, and they're saying quite openly that they are doing so because they don't want the chaotic free-for-all of today's liberal democracies. Meanwhile, on the other hand, the West is shying away from taking on the tech companies, appalled by the modern media totalitarianism that's on the rise in numerous autocratic, pseudo-democratic regimes around the world. This political context undermines the fundamental principles and purposes of press freedom, especially the news media's role in holding governments to account for their words and their actions, as opposed to the government holding the media to account. So, as we look to this shifting media landscape, and as we navigate an age in which reporters are threatened, institutions debased, and basic facts somehow become subject to debate and political interference, our goal at the New York Times is to prove that there is a path forward for all of those who care about the future of quality journalism around the world. But it's a path that needs to be forged together, working with the social media platforms and society at large. This can only be the solution. And I put it to you that this matters. Too often, journalists risk their freedom, and in some cases, too often their lives, to report the truth. It's up to all of us who believe you can't have a democracy without the freedom of the press and freedom of expression to fight for these journalists, to stand tall in defense of the unifying power of truth, to stand tall in defense of the great journalism we all embrace. That's the kind of journalism that adds value to society, that tells stories that would not otherwise be told, that enlightens and engages, journalism that exposes wrongdoing, that prompts reform and thwarts the abusive and the secretive. We need journalism that, as Iphigenie Sulzberger, the great-grandmother of A.G. Sulzberger, our current publisher of the New York Times, put it in her memoirs, journalism that takes corruption by the tail and shakes it it until only the truth is left. Thank you very much.